I'm not at all a specialist of climate change. I'm an historian and sociologist of science and medicine. I've been working on biomedical research, therapeutic innovation issues for quite a long time. And so what I want to do is just to make a few general remarks about this question of what might be the part played by the social sciences and make a plea for kind of more integrative research, and the previous talk has actually laid the path for what I want to allude to. And just as last warning, actually what I'm going to say is based on the reading of some of the recent literature in social sciences dealing with health and climate change. Interestingly enough, most of this literature is coming from UK. And my reading is actually informed by historical and anthropological study we started a few years ago, which focuses on the transition from post-World War II international public health to global health. And there are many resonances between what is at stake in global health and climate change, I would say. So my first remark is about the novelty and the seriousness of the threat. We all know these images of storms, of air pollution, and as well as some of the health-related facts. So for instance, in the case of the Hurricane Katrina, with the flooding came all new types of infectious risks from the open water, and the fear that people were going to get sick because of contaminated food or water dominated. But in the end, it was mental health and issues of trauma, which proved the most enduring problem, reinforced by the poor management of the disaster. Similarly, air pollution in China is now thought to result in 7.4 times more frequent premature death than in Europe. And it has been estimated that ambient concentration of particulate matter lead to the loss of 40 months from the average life expectancy. And thus this toll can only increase if current patterns of energy consumption remain the same. Well, in spite of this visibility and new frequency of storms, drought, floods, and hot waves associated with climate change, questioning the impact of climate change on health is a relatively new topic. And I want to come back to that for a second. In 2004, using the global burden of disease methodology, WHO ranked climate as the 21st source of health problems out of 24. And the consensus was then that this was a peripheral issue, at least for the present, with the consequence that there was no urgent need to redefine global health strategies and priorities. However, a few years later, in 2009, The Lancet published an article by a multidisciplinary commission established in collaboration with University College London. And the paper, which was a review paper, actually did not focus on the present, but on the future damages, and labeled climate change the biggest global threat in the 21st century. In the next 5 years, concerns have been mounting among experts and international organizations alike, and even if the case is not over, the seriousness of the issue is now much less challenged. And commenting on the publication of the last IPCC report, WHO now estimates that we have much stronger evidence that the negative health impacts of climate change will outweigh the positive ones. WHO reading is now that climate change will act mainly, at least until the middle of this century, by exacerbating health problems that already exist, and that IPCC data supports the case that undernutrition resulting from reduction in food production, injury and disease due to intense heat waves and fires will be the most important risk connecting climate change and health. So finally, no later than this year, a renewed and enlarged Lancet Commission published a major assessment of both the impact of climate change and the necessary policy responses. The report makes the important argument that impact is less a matter of direct effects, the highly dramatic climatic event I started with, than a matter of indirect effects whose outcome will be strongly reinforced or attenuated by social dynamics. And this slide has already been used by Robert in relation to the exposome. We can use it for the contribution of social and economical dynamics involved. So this brings in my second remark, namely that the present mode of participation of social sciences to public health and climate research is inadequate to the challenge. This participation follows classical patterns, those prevailing in global health, with two modes of research, I would say. The first one is the participation to epidemiological studies with a special eye on social determinants of health. The second mode is the autonomous pursuit of qualitative studies, mostly ethnographic studies, in complement and juxtaposition to the more quantitative work. And a good example of the first mode and its limitations, I think, is the research on the impact of climate change on vector-borne diseases. Most studies focusing on malaria and dengue. In the case of dengue, for instance, a recent review by Nesh and collaborators shows how modeling first relies on the biological features of transmission and the search for correlations between meteorological data and transmission with a scant, here it's the two paragraphs involved, a scant inclusion of social and demographic variables. The juxtaposition paradigm I'm alluding to, and which dominates our current work, does not mean that we are only left with that kind of superficial information on the social dynamics underlying the direct effects of climate change. Here I just want to mention the work of my colleague at CNRS, Anne Lovell, on Katrina. She conducted a long ethnography of the responses to mental health problems following over several years the trajectory of displaced people. What she shows is not only that the impact of Katrina on health was greatly increased by the lack of preparation and the catastrophic management after the hurricane. More importantly, I think, she documents the fact that the framework for the intervention, which focused on the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, actually proved completely inadequate, leaving out not only especially vulnerable categories like patients already affected with mental health problems, but also leaving out all questions about race inequality and its massive presence and importance in New Orleans. So my first remark is that the challenges climate change poses to health make this model of juxtaposed research with complementary rather than common object insufficient. And there is a need for a more integrative agenda, which has sometimes been labeled an ecological turn in public health. Here, I'd like to switch focus from the assessment of impact to the debates on responses, taking on board the now classical distinction between mitigation and adaptation. In both instances, there is a strong argument to pay more attention to health in climate research, since the indirect and complex relationship the Lancet Commission I was mentioning tries to map will prove decisive, so these indirect effects. The discussion is often framed in terms of co-benefits. Roughly speaking, the idea that inadequate responses to climate change will show indirect benefits for health, and conversely, that health interventions will benefit to adaptation and mitigation strategies. The debate on mitigation is now increasingly centered on the global energy system and the necessary transition to a decarbonized economy, which would massively reduce the uses of coal, oil, and gas. However, the dialectics of co-benefits is biased in one direction. I mean that we have now very interesting computations combining climate, economic, and public health data, suggesting that if health benefits are taken into account and internalized, then the cost of the energy transition, first of all, the cost of new infrastructure, will actually be easily matched. and that the transition, at least in pure quantitative economic terms, is not such a massive and difficult one. But what is left out from this approach are the more intricate relations which operate outside the energy system. For instance, between agricultural practices, food supply, nutrition patterns, and health. Without integrated research mobilizing not only technological or economic knowledge, but also the social sciences, these will be impossible to decipher beyond impressionist claims. And here I just want to take one example from the co-benefits discussion of local, much more local remediation strategies. I mean the policy of green cities. Green cities are recent initiatives which have gained increasing visibility with the difficulty at achieving a post-Kyoto global agreement. More easily adopted because they are local, these policies focus on reducing the uses of cars, enlarging green and blue spaces, or favoring local consumption to decrease long-range transport of goods. They are deemed to increase health, in two respects. Firstly, because they help reduce the negative consequences of air pollution. Secondly, because they will induce people in living less sedentary lives, cycling, walking, and therefore will reduce the risk of cardiovascular disorders and obesity. This might well be the case or not. Without an analysis of circulation needs as well as nutrition practices and of their economical and social context, the later point, in contrast to the former, is pure guess. So my fourth remark is that an integrative, more ecological agenda for investigating the relationship between climate change and public health can't happen without a significant change in the way the social sciences themselves work. And sociology, anthropology, and even history have to take into account not only what they are good at, I mean, for instance, social bonds, culture, institutional and political constraints, or class, gender, and ethnicity dynamics. They also have to become more sensitive to ecological constraints per se, taking into account the materiality of interaction and the seriousness of ecological tensions. And there are interesting signs of this displacement. And here I just want to mention one example with the evaluation of ecosystem services and their value. This study of the mangrove ecosystem located in the vicinity of Taipan in Taiwan resulted in a model of the value of the mangrove that integrates a list of ecosystem functions, ecosystem services, and contribution to human well-being, which was established by a panel of experts ranging from hydrologists and ecologists to anthropologists and architects, actually. So my fifth and last remark is that one additional role of the social sciences is to provide information and tools for a better and more reflexive understanding of our own actions, including the global politics of climate change. The book our colleagues Ami Dahan and Stéphane Écoute just published on the 20 years dynamics of climate negotiation is a case to the point. Dahan and Écoute's point of departure is the failure of this negotiation. Well, not the failure in attracting attention to climate change. I mean, in this respect, negotiations were a huge success. But the failure in delivering a post-Kyoto framework and a significant change in greenhouse gas emission. The books provide a detailed description of the regulation and a provocative but well-argued analysis of what they call a mounting denial of reality. And the center of the argument is, echoing the previous talk, a historical assessment of this denial. And they point to 5 important elements which have contributed to make climate negotiation increasingly divorced from reality and inefficient. I just mentioned them briefly because they also resonate with many patterns of action in global health. First, they say that there was an underestimation of the inequalities underlying climate change. first of all, between developed and developing countries. And this neglect backlashed in the mounting discussion about the historical responsibility of the developed countries in the accumulation of greenhouse gas. Second, there was a poor attention paid to the dynamics of economic globalization, reinforcing a certain fascination for the idea of a dematerialized economy with an inability to take into account the role and the needs of emerging industrial nations, China in the first place. Third, the priority given to market-based forms of regulation resulted in the centrality attributed to the creation of a global market for carbon emission permits without much attention to its social and political preconditions. Fourth, the structure of negotiation remained UN-based, centered on the role of nation states, with many actors, while many actors are non-governmental, operating at a different, much less global level. And fifth, there was a certain naivety and overconfidence in the role of experts, and this placed the IPCC in a central position, not only as knowledge production body and reviewers, but also as the entity giving the overarching framework for the negotiation, with the consequence that there was a growing disconnection between the IPCC abstract models focusing on greenhouse gas concentration and the concerns of most actors. And to conclude and finish, I want to say that this analysis of the denial of reality is not a pessimistic reading, but a reminder that climate negotiations are predicated upon major issues of social and environmental justice, which ought to be addressed as such. And I would just add that this probably also applies to global health. Thank you.
Thank you very much.